Welcome to another episode of The Clever Dev. Today what we are going to do is manually recreate the outline variant of the text field, but I am not using MUI. I'm actually starting with React-Bootstrap, and it really just gives us a starting place with some default styling, but it's really just manual HTML and CSS for the most part that we're going to use, and of course with React hooks to recreate this notched effect in the outline. So if you want to dive deep into the React text field, and I'll look at the DOM over here and see how they accomplish this notched effect. If you want to learn about that and see how it can be recreated, then stick around. First, we need to come over here to the MUI docs, and we need to dig into the DOM and see how the outlined text field is accomplishing this notched effect. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put some filler text in there so that we can unselect it or unfocus it and the notch outline effect stays active. So here I have in DevTools the elements that compose the text field, and here we are looking at the MUI input base root. And what I want to do is I want to find what is necessary to make that notched outline and to have the label. So here we have a label element, and we can see if I take my mouse off that, then I lose the effect, but if you look over on the left side, you can see that the element is highlighted over in our actual web page. And if I go down to the legend, an interesting thing is that it also is highlighting what looks to be that same area. So what's going on is, even though these both have text, like we can see that outline text there, and we can see outlined over here, they both actually have this text, but only one of them is actually supplying the text that is visible, and the other one is supplying the gap in the border on the text field. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this legend here, just straight out of the HTML. So we can see that the legend was actually sitting on top of the border, and that was its purpose, really, was just to be killing that border and creating that little gap. So now I will delete that outlined label text, or really the label that has that outline text, and we can see that the notched outline effect is gone. So that's kind of a quick summary of how it works, and it really took me quite a while to figure out the best approach, and that they were using two components, one to do the covering and the other to actually be like the visible text. So we can take that same approach in our code. Now let's jump over to the code. Here we are with some starter code, and once again I'm using React-Bootstrap, and here in React-Bootstrap it's the form control component that actually has the border and is actually basically the input where the text goes, and that's conceptually different than it is in MUI. So if you're coming from a knowledge of MUI, just remember that the form control is not the same here in React-Bootstrap. So the input group is actually what we will put our event handlers on. So our goal here is, of course, we need to create those two elements that we just saw in MUI's text field, one for covering the border in a small area to create the notched effect, and the other to be the text that's visible in that notched area. And then, before we create those, really, we need to think about our events that we want to listen for so that we apply the proper styling at the proper times. So those events are going to be our onFocus, onBlur, and onChange. So of course, if they click in, that focuses it. If they blur, if there's no text in the text field, then we want to remove that notched effect. And if they blur but there is text, we want to leave that notched effect. So let's go ahead and get to work on that part. So I'm going to do the onFocus first. And for now, I'll just add an empty event handler here, and let's say onBlur, and then the last one will be onChange. So in our onFocus, what we want to do is we want to, we actually are going to need a state value up here that the onFocus supplies a kind of an activated value to. So we'll keep it simple, and we'll actually just call the state value activated, and then of course set activated. And we'll say React use state, And we want this to have a default of false because we don't want the app to render with a notched effect in place unless we did something like supplied a default value to it. So we'll get there. Then I'm going to say const value and set value. And this will also be React use state. And here I'm going to supply an empty string. So this one is going to control the activation, and then this one is going to be our store of has there been text applied or typed into the text field. So now that we've got these values, what we can do is we can go down here to our onFocus, and anytime that a focus happens, we do want to call this setActivated, and we'll supply it with a true value. Because this onFocus occurs only on focus, it's not the off focus. The lack of focus, or the focus being removed, is this on blur. And so here what we want to do is we're going to once again call setActivated. But instead of just always supplying a false value, we want to leave the activation state if there is text inside. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the value state prop or state value up here and convert it to a Boolean, and then if our blur happens but there is a value, then the activated state will still be true. So then our onChange, of course this value is just an empty string at the moment, and we don't have anything that is ever changing that, so we need our onChange to control that. So what we'll do is I will say e for event, and then react.changeEvent, and we'll use HTML input element. Of course, I've got TypeScript enabled here. I always like to use TypeScript. I find it to be very good practice. Set value, and we'll say e.target.value. So let's pause for a moment in our code and go over to our app and make sure that everything is well. And it is. It functions so far. There's no bugs appearing in the console. So it may be a little hard to see because the border's not too dark, but when I focus on it, then you can probably see that text field pretty well. So there's no change in functionality so far. All we've done is add a few listeners or handlers, and so they're not really doing anything yet. What we're going to do now is we are going to apply some, we'll build those two elements that I mentioned, and then conditionally apply styling to them based on these events that we have. Here we are back in the code, but I want to mention for a moment that in the video details, there is a link to an article where I have all this code, so if you wanted to copy-paste, you could copy-paste from there. And also, it has a few other resources like screenshots and so on. Also, I have a link in the video details to my MUI Advanced Component Styling course that's on Udemy, and I keep an active coupon in my videos, so that's in the video details, so definitely check that out. I went super in-depth in styling MUI components, so yeah, just really high-quality stuff there. I think if you take that course, then you will not have any trouble styling an MUI component ever again, and there is a live Q&A. I say live, there's a Q&A, and so you can ask me questions if you ever come across anything that you're not sure how to style in MUI. So anyway, with that said, then let's move on to, first I want to put a better border on our text field here, so I'm going to target this form control. So interestingly, in React-Bootstrap, then these components, it's just like MUI in the sense that a component is ultimately composed of two things. A component is composed of a normal HTML element like we're used to, and a component is also composed of a class. And the class is what applied to that component really, a class on that element is supplying that styling that makes us think of components, whether MUI or React-Bootstrap. So the form control component that we were just looking at, it has, by default, a class called form control on it. And we could look at the DOM and find that if we wanted to. So I'm going to use that, and I'm going to put a border of 2px solid on here. And then I'm going to use a border color, and I'm going to do a bootstrappy thing here. Bootstrap has some cool features to it. It has a bunch of variables. The method of styling is obviously different. So In MUI, we have that new SX prop, which is a really cool thing in MUI 5. Makes styling very easy, and it gives you access to what they call their system, which is like styling utilities. In Bootstrap, that stuff is kind of even a little more built in, you could say. So if I've got class name here, you can see this example in React Bootstrap. And if you're an MUI person, this is just kind of an interesting high-level overview of React Bootstrap. They kind of do a tailwindy thing. So instead of adding this border of 2px solid, I could have used, I forget exactly the class name, but it's basically something like that. I think I'd have to add border and border 2, and then it'll apply a border that has a 2-pixel width to it. And those utilities, those class utilities, can be customized if I wanted to for theming an app. But anyway, for this video, I'm pretty much gonna just stick to targeting the classes that already exist on the components by default. But I may use the occasional Bootstrap variable like this primary. So this is their primary color, which is a blue very similar to MUI's primary color. So anyway, the other thing that I want to do is I'm going to say form control when the focus pseudo class is applied, then I'm going to strip off the box shadow. So I'll just say box shadow none there. So now we've got just a little bit better, but more styling on our form control here. The next thing that I'm going to do now is I am going to actually go in and add our label, and then I will add a div. So the label will supply the text that goes in the notch, and the div will supply the notching or the covering up of the existing border. So let's get this label in here. This is just a React label, nothing React Bootstrappy here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a class name on here, and then the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to supply our some text in here. And so this class name is really where our magic happens, you could say. There's quite a bit of in-depth styling that we'll have to do in these classes, but this class name, I actually don't want just a single class name or even a static class name. So I'm actually going to have a dynamic class name. So we are going to use our activated value now. And so I'm going to detect whether activated is true or false. And if it's true, then I will supply the TextField label activated class, which we have not made yet. Otherwise, I will supply the TextField label unactivated. And then there is one more thing that will be static on here, and so that is going to be just a space here and then a class called TextField label. So this just supplies some underlying styling, which is why it's not dynamic, and then these will supply, really, the purpose of them is to move this label into the proper location. So we can see there's nothing special so far. I've got my form control here, and we can see our input group and our form control here. And then here, right next to it, we can see our label. So this input group does have display flex on it by default, which is why these are right next to each other instead of one on top of the other. But anyway, we can see that our text field label is unactivated right now. And if I click into here, as in give it focus, give our form control focus, then we can see that the class dynamically changed to text field label activated, and we still have this text field label class. So those are all good things. Now let's actually go into our code and supply some styling. So I'm going to say text field label. We'll start with this one first. And the first thing we need to do is we need to get our text field label inside, visually inside of our text field, so that it's not to the right of it. That's no use to us right now. So I'll say position. Instead of relative, I'll say absolute. And my VS Code is not being as helpful as I hope, but there we go. The next thing that I'm going to do is I want a little bit of animation on here. So I'm going to say transition. And I'll say what we're going to transition on. I've already done the research for this, and so I already am aware of it. Normally, I wouldn't add our transition until doing some other styling, because you got to figure out what styling you need to get this text field label in the exact position. But I've already done the research, and so I can say I know that's going to be the top and the left values. Those are the ones that I'm going to customize to get our text field label into position. What that means is if I want a little bit of gentle transition on that movement of the text field label when it's moved up to that notched area, or if the text field has no focus and no text, then it's moved down inside the text field again, then I want to transition gently on the top and the left values. So the other thing I'm going to do is some line height. This was just me playing around, and I found that a line height of 1 rem was really just the perfect thing for this text label to get it vertically looking centered. I hate to call it vertical centered because I'm using line height. But anyway, that just made it look a little bit nicer. So now we need to supply our text field label unactivated and activated. So there's that one, and I'm just going to copy paste this and say activated. So we've got both of those now. In our unactivated, then this absolute positioning that we added up here is pretty much all that we need. I'm just going to adjust it a little bit with a left value of 1 rem, and that will just bump it away from the very edge, the very leftmost edge of the inside of that text field. And I'll say a top value of 0.5 rem. So we've got that line height of 1, so we're going to be taking half of that and just bumping our text field a little more into a centered position when it is inside, bumping our label into a little more centered of position when it's inside of our text field. The other thing now is this activated class, and so I will add a left value of 0.75 rem, and then a top of negative 0.5 rem, and then a z index of, I'll say 9999 because I want this to be on top of everything else, and a padding of 0px and 2px. So the purpose of this padding is just to give it a little bit more room in that notched area. So what I want to do now is I want to, of course, go to our app and test our code. So far, so good. When we have a focus event, then our label is being kicked up to the right spot, and it looks pretty close to the positioning on the MUI text field here in our React-Bootstrap homebrewed text field. So when I click out and it loses focus, then because there's no text inside the text field, then the label goes back inside of it, so that's good. Now if I click back in and I type something like test and I click out, then our label still stays up in the soon-to-be notched area, so that is also good. It detected, we supplied this test to that React state value that we just called value, and we're detecting that value exists or is a non-false value, a truthy value. And so we've got our label then still having this text field label activated class because we have a value in our text field. So that is all super. And let's go back to our code here. Now the next thing that we need is we're going to add a div, and the div will be used to supply the actual notched effect. And so it's a similar thing to our label where we have a class name and we're using this activated idea. So on our div, we actually don't need this closing tag, so we're not going to have anything inside of here. And once again, we're using our activated value. Instead of text field label activated, I'll call it text field label cover because it's covering over. So there we have that. And instead of just text field label as our default styling, I'll have text field label cover. So now we've got those 3 classes in place, and we also need then to, of course, supply some styling to those, But one other thing that we're going to do is we're actually going to add some width to our div here. And so instead of using a class to do that, I'm actually going to be dynamically calculating that width from a ref that we will add to this label that will detect its width. So since it needs to be dynamic and it's based on some hooks and variables and so on, then what I'll do is I will add it to an inline styling value, and we'll use a value called cover width, which I have not made yet. So anyway, let's go up here, and what we're going to do is we are going to create our ref, and it's going to be a ref on our label. And so we've got our useRef value and HTML label element for our typing here, and then just kind of a typical React hook here. We're going to start this, or we're going to give it a value of null. Don't be confused by that. That's pretty much just how these refs work. The examples in React pretty much always supply, or always supply as far as I've seen, a null value to begin with. And then we need that cover width value. And set cover width. And I really like the React use state hook. Use it a whole lot. So we'll start our cover width with a value of 0. So down here, our div would have a width of 0 just by default with the initial rendering before the label has been rendered and we've detected any width on that label. So what we need to do is, of course, use our label ref. We need to supply it to our label here. And so I'm going to say just a simple ref equals label ref. Then the other thing that we need to do is we need to actually be setting this cover width based on our label ref. So for that, we are going to use useEffect. So inside of here, what we are going to do is I will observe this label ref anytime it changes, as in anytime that the label itself re-renders, then this useEffect will be called again. So inside of here, what we need to do is simply set our cover width. That's the entire goal of it. So we'll set our cover width, and I'm going to get access to the label ref. I'll say label ref.current, and then you just have to do some TypeScripty stuff right here. Make sure that it's going to be satisfied that current exists. So if label ref.current exists, then I will say label ref.current. And here's a really useful function: get bounding client ref rect. And then, so this value here has a lot of different values about the element in the DOM. So the value that we care about is width. So if that doesn't exist, as in if the label ref.current doesn't exist, then I'm just going to supply a default value of 0. So then our notching div would just have 0 width. So one thing I'm going to do here, and this isn't the greatest, I guess, but I'm going to just add a value of 6 to give it a little bit extra width beyond our label. So that'll take into account, it'll just make it look nicer. It's basically 3 extra pixels on each side. There may be a more dynamic way to do that, but I would think that I would want that area fixed. So anyway, and we should have all the things in place now to supply our styling on our div, our width on our div, but what we have not yet done is we have not yet actually populated these classes here. So let's go do that. Let's go add our TextField cover. So that name is TextField label cover. So this is that default class that's going to always be on our covering div or our notching div. So once again, it's a lot like the text field label that supplies the text. Our position is going to be absolute, and then we're going to have transition on it again, and it's going to be that same transition. In fact, so we'll say top. You know what? In fact, we're not even going to have this extra class. I'm just going to reuse this class. We actually want all these same values now that I'm thinking about it. So we want our cover and our label both to have a line height of 1 rem, both to have this transition, and both to have this absolute. So what I'll do is I'll actually change the name of this. Sometimes I learn as I go in these videos. So I'm going to change that name to, instead of text field label, which was too specific to our label component, I'll just call it text field notching. And same thing down there. So we're using that class. That's a little more efficient than what I initially planned. So cool stuff there. But we do still need our text field label cover activated and unactivated classes. So as I look at the code, thinking about how we are sharing this CSS, then I'm actually going to do the same thing for our text field label and our text field label cover of unactivated. We actually would have the exact same styling for both unactivated states. So I'm actually going to just use an unactivated state on an unactivated class on both of these, because it's going to be identical styling. So optimizing a little bit here, even in the video, compared to my notes for before the video. So the other thing that we need to do is our activated class, our text field label activated, there is once again a lot of shared styling, but it's not identical. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to pop this down here, and then I'm going to copy paste all of this, and we will still keep this text field label activated class, but I'm also going to just have an activated class. So this is the shared styling for both of our activated classes. Then the text field label activated will have this z-index of 9999. Here we'll have z-index of 9998, so that the notching is behind the label, since the label has the text. And the other thing that we need here is we need some background color, white, and a height of 2px. So this was an interesting challenge. I finally figured out that we need our notching or our label cover to be exactly the height that the form control border is. So that way, let's say our form control is sitting on inside of some container that has, let's say, a gray background. We don't want this white to kind of spill over and create a little bit of white area in that gray background. We don't want it to be too tall vertically, basically. So we only want it to be precisely as tall as the thickness of our form control. So this is how we accomplish it. Turned out to be a rather simple thing, but it actually stumped me for quite a while, just because MUI takes a different approach. That's not really how MUI is accomplishing making sure they don't have any spillover. So this was just a simpler solution. So anyway, I think with that, what we need to do now is we need to have both an activated class here and down here. And then let's take a look at this in our app and make sure that everything is working well. Now we're going to come over to our app and make sure everything looks good. And in fact, it does not look good. Our label is still in the right spot, but our text field notching is not in the right spot. So let me put a little bit of dummy text in there. It looks like we're just a little bit too high. So I think I got a little too ambitious with putting some shared styling together. Looks like we actually don't need a top value on here. So that's what I get for changing on the fly and not following my notes. But anyway, that looks like a pretty easy fix. Let's go over to our code, and instead of having this top value in our shared activated styling, I can just put it in our text field label activated. So the label did need this top value of -0.5. Our label cover doesn't. So let's take a look and see how that does now. I'm going to refresh this, and I think things will be good now. There we go. So that's all better. So it looks like our div, our covering div here, just its natural positioning is exactly where it needs to be. And this label, probably because it was, it had a height to it and was filled with text, then it needed some adjustment to its positioning. It has a height of 16 px, which is 1 rem, so to move that up, we wanted to move it up half of its height, or this top of negative 0.5 rem, so that's why that one did need to move. This one just essentially had, well, not 0px height, but 2px height, which is exactly the height it needed, and so it just was already in the right spot, and we didn't need any top value to adjust it. So with that, then we have basically an MUI text field here, and it is pretty dynamic. I was messing around with it some. I've got a fixed height on here, a fixed width on here, but if we take that off, then the notch behaves pretty well. It's not getting confused or lost or anything, so this is really, I think, pretty good to go. So it's kind of interesting to me to see how much simpler in the DOM our text field was that we created here compared to the MUI text field that has, I don't remember how many elements inside of it, but far, far more. It was wrapped in a form control, which is different than the React-Bootstrap form control that we're using here, but that was one of the components that definitely adds some value on the MUI text field. But then it had a lot of internal elements that maybe it's just elements that exist in order to aid in supplying different variants or something. I'm really not sure, but I like how simple and clean and lightweight our text field is here. That is really, we didn't even need this input group. It's really just 3 elements. And so I think this is pretty cool stuff here. So I hope that this video was helpful, and have a wonderful day.